Thank you. Time flies when you're busy. We've been doing this for a long time. I think we started, and I'm trapping myself up. You got me in this kind of corner here. Let me see if I can. You all kind of I feel like I want to walk toward you. So we've been doing this for a long time. We started in the 90s, and I started in 1993. And when I started in the field of HIV, we were all called to the field because we wanted to save lives. We were losing what I consider some of the best, the most creative, the most talented individuals to this disease. And as a student, I just thought, well, this is what I need to do. If I can be of service and help, this is where I need to be. And so that was the context in which we all started working in the field together. And we've been working really hard to make things better for people. And I think we've had some successes, which I'll talk about. And we've learned a lot of things along the way. And what I'd like to do in my brief time this morning is just share some things that we've learned about traumatic stress and how it particularly impacts people living with HIV. And I'd like this much to be more of a conversation because we are early in the field. We have a lot of cross-sectional data, a lot of correlational data. Where we need to go next is to figure out why. What are the mediators? What are the moderators? What can we do given this knowledge? And you all are part of that next generation of folks to figure that out. So I'm going to be asking you, I don't know, what should we do? So like I said, when we first started, this is where I came into the epidemic, right about here. And you can see the death rates. This is the peak. And over time, we've seen that decrease, thank goodness, as we have antiretroviral therapies. What this chart tells us that the epidemic has always disproportionately affected men, and that's still the case today. Globally, many of us, we started in the United States working on this on both coasts, in California, where I'm from, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and you all in New York. And since then, we've been tasked to really look at this global epidemic, where we've got about 38 million people or so living with HIV globally. And like I said, in the United States, it was really the coast, the West and the East coast when this epidemic started. We were the ones that were disproportionately impacted by it. It's still the case here, although we see HIV infection rates increasing in the southern part of the United States. You all in New York, a third of people living with HIV live in New York. So you all are really at the center in terms of people living with HIV. How do we assist in reducing new infection rates? How do we assist people living with the virus? And importantly, how do we keep people who are negative from becoming positive? So again, you can see that disproportionately males are impacted by HIV compared to females. These are new infection rates. So more than 2/3 of the new infections of HIV are among men who have sex with men in the United States. We do have racial ethnic disparity. This has been really at the heart of the work that I've been doing as it relates to trauma. And when I talk about trauma, I'm talking about all-cause trauma. So this could be sexual abuse, it could be physical abuse, it could be an invalidating environment as a child, it can be bullying. We've got a lot of data that talks about bullying as a traumatic stressor, particularly for men who have sex with men. And I'll talk a little bit about that study, but the rates, well, let's talk about it now. We did a study. One of my fellows at the time was really interested in, particularly for men who have sex with men, their sexual identity and what happens to these young men as little boys in terms of bullying in schools and the impact that that has on them as adults. And so he conducted a study, and we thought, well, we'll probably see some distress. We may see, some depression, anxiety. We might see something like that. But what we found was much more provocative. we found the rates of PTSD were higher for those men when we compared them to men who had been subjected to things like violence or threats of death, that the rates of PTSD for these men was higher from bullying, childhood bullying. And that was intriguing to us. But I'll put it in perspective from a neurological standpoint to help explain why that is. So let me go back to the racial ethnic disparity. African Americans are about 12% of the population, Hispanic Latinos about 17%. But when we look at new infection rates, they account for 70%. That's a huge disparity. And most of these, again, are among men who have sex with men. So if you're thinking about building a career in this field, you know, for the fellows, the people who are just coming into it, really you want to be looking at young MSM, and particularly young MSM of color, because this is where our new infections are still occurring. So what about trauma and HIV? So how does one even pair the two together? Well, I can tell you, before 9/11, I wrote a grant to NIH, and I said, I want to create an intervention that targets trauma-related symptoms in an effort to reduce risk behavior. They sent back the comments to me, and they were like, what are you thinking? What does trauma and HIV have to do with one another? No, you need to rethink yourself, and we're not feeling this grant. I was like, wow, okay. They did score me. This was back in the day when you did get a score. But the comments were like, no, you're barking up the wrong tree here. We're not having any of this. And so I'm trying to think, well, how do I retool this grant? You know, this is like my first grant. This is like an RO3. I'm just trying to get my foot in the door, people. They weren't having it. So then 9/11 hit. You know, the towers came down, and people were experiencing what trauma really was and how it impacted not only them, but people they loved and cared about. And they didn't even have to be in the city to experience that trauma and what that did to them in terms of anxiety, the sense of not knowing what the future held. And so I didn't really do much to that grant except for changed a few things and said nice things in my entry letter to them about how appreciative I was of their comments. And it scored a perfect score. It's the only perfect score I've ever had on a grant. Couldn't believe it. People were like, well, what'd you do? What'd you do? But people understood that trauma experience could impact behavior that had really nothing to do with the initial trauma. They got it, and they got it clearly after 9/11, and I credit that for launching my research career. But in comparison to the general population, people living with HIV tend to experience more traumatic experiences. And we have found this finding over and over again in many different studies in many different settings. There's a relationship between previous trauma and subsequent HIV infection, and it has to do with risk behavior, substance use in particular. People are trying to numb themselves and avoid thoughts and feelings associated with previous trauma. We've also known that greater PTSD symptoms have been associated with greater medical symptoms, and a lot of that has to do with poor adherence, not being diagnosed early, ignoring symptoms. There's a whole host of reasons of why that's true. But just know that if we do not help people deal with their trauma and they're living with HIV, the trajectory for them in terms of their health is very, very poor. Well, what do we know about a traumatic experience? Just, you know, as a human condition. Well, we know that there's really 4 major trajectories. You know, so you can have something really horrible happen to you, and then what happens is we call it resilience if you have very little or few trauma symptoms. That somehow you're able to garner the support that you need, you're able to pick yourself up, and not really have too many difficulties based on that traumatic experience. Then there's recovery. There are people who experience initial symptoms, but then over time, they get better and they do better. The two pathways that I've been focused on in my career are the delayed and the chronic distress. And delayed is where a traumatic event happens, people seem to be doing really well, but then later on they start to become symptomatic. We have some evidence that those people are actually the case that have worse outcomes in terms of overall health and able to recover. And chronic distress are people who are high distress that remains high. It just doesn't go away. We typically know these people right away. You know, we can see them. They're upset, they're in our office, they're calling us, and they just kind of stay in a chronic state of distress all the time. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's so, too. I see some of you nodding your head, so some of you have some of these clients and patients. What do we know about childhood and adult risk? Well, we know that risk behavior often develops in response to traumatic experiences. So, and if you think about it this way, when there's a physical and emotional abuse during one's childhood, you know, the sense of who you are in the world is challenged, especially as these kids grow up and they start having interactions with other kids and they realize that what they're going through isn't typical. Not every kid has this experience. And even more so, they start to get the social stigma around it, the sort of ooh factor. And that becomes overwhelming when they realize that something bad and shameful is happening to them. And individuals who experience this, what they do, the human nature, the brain wants to find comfort, they want to find safety and security. We are hardwired that way. If someone were to come in here now and start yelling, we would all try and find a way to make ourselves and others safe. It's just part of the human condition. And it's no different than with people who've experienced trauma. And so what they do is they start to engage in behaviors that they found work for them to avoid the feelings, thoughts surrounded by the trauma. And sometimes they'll numb these feelings. And so we think of this in adults: alcohol, sex, eating, shopping, gambling, you know, all these things to numb and to forget what's going on. And so we've known this for a while. We got a lot of data about it. You know, we had the DSMs, we had that all talk about PTSD and, you know, the things that happen. But we really didn't know why. We just knew there was a correlation and association, but we really didn't know why. Well, the field of neuroscience has really helped us to understand what's happening. Why is this so? And what they found is that with traumatic experience, what we've seen in children is that the brain is actually damaged. When we got these first findings, we were like, whoa, what do you mean damaged? Well, there's low total cerebral volume. What that means is their brains are smaller compared to kids that didn't undergo any trauma. We also found changes in the function of the prefrontal cortex, which is really important, because if you know anything about your frontal cortex, this is where our parents live. This is where your ego lives. This is where judgment, logic, and executive function. This is the part of our brain that keeps all of us seated in our seats right now instead of jumping up, doing jumping jacks, or doing something like this. That would be inappropriate for this setting. So our prefrontal cortex is like, no, don't do it. And some of you are like, oh, I'd really like to check, you know, my email, but oh, she might see me or not. You know, that's all right here. So if you have damage and you're a kid to that area, and your teacher tells you to sit in your seat, and instead you go up and start picking on your friend, and your teacher's like, get back, and all of a sudden now you've got behavioral conduct, behavioral disorders. All of a sudden now you're not learning, you're being disruptive. You're labeled as hyperactive because you can't sit still. But it's a different part of the brain when it comes to trauma of why you can't keep still. And that happens in the prefrontal cortex. And you have difficulty shifting to what's relevant information. So some of you have worked with these kids and even adults that they're attending to things and you're like, don't worry about that. That's not important. What I really need you to do is make this appointment on Tuesday. And they keep asking you about something that happened in group. And you're like, that's not important. It's a problem in the brain structure with the prefrontal cortex. Poor hippocampus function. The thing that we know about the hippocampus, and we've learned this from early Alzheimer patients, is that in early Alzheimer's, the hippocampus starts to get destroyed. And this is where memories live. And so when you have a poor hippocampal functioning, you've got difficulty with learning new information and with retrieving old information. As a small child in school who's trying to learn, can you imagine? So these kids get labeled with learning disabilities, behavioral misconduct, hyperactivity, all kind of mislabels when really the culprit is a pre-existing trauma. And so you can see how those kids grow up and become adults and become people that we're trying to work with now. And the brain structures have been disruptive. They've grown up developmentally with a poor functioning brain. So we try to get them into our interventions about reducing risk, and we're teaching them skills, and then they come back and not much has changed, and you're thinking, this was such a good intervention. It had a good effect size with other populations. What's happening? It might be trauma that you're not assessing and that you're not accounting for. And so I'm just going to show you a little bit about, I'm not going to get too neuroscience-y on you, but I do want you to understand, what's happening for folks. So if I see a snake here and my eyes identify it, okay, that's a snake, the signal goes to the thalamus, this area right here. The thalamus does something quite unique. The thalamus is sort of like the part of the brain that's like, okay, I'm getting in some sensory information from the eyes. What am I going to do with this? Well, the thalamus does a couple of things. Whoops. It sends a signal to the amygdala, which the amygdala, I want you to know, this is where we think the disruption happens for people with traumatic stress. That is the first place. This is where fear lives. And it's also related to anxiety disorder. So, if you stimulate the amygdala in a lab, people will have panic attacks, they get anxious. So we know that it has been related to anxiety disorders. The thing about the amygdala, this is where fear memories live. This is where emotional fear lives. So if I perceive something as threatening, and the thalamus says, yep, it's threatening, and it goes to my amygdala, it starts to get this fear response. The thalamus does something else, though. It also sends a signal to our visual cortex, because the thalamus is like, well, this is what we see, but we're not sure. Is this really a threat? So your cortex, your visual cortex says, yeah, people, that's a snake, and it then sends a signal back again to the amygdala. So the amygdala gets activated twice. And the occipital lobe, the visual cortex, this is where reasoning, because remember, this is the cortex. You got the frontal lobe and the parietal. This is where all the thinking and reasoning, executive function. So this part of our brain is supposed to tell us, yep, that's a snake. Oh, it's a garden snake. Don't worry. Oh, deadly snake, get out. So it also then starts to send a signal to your central nervous system, and that's where fight or flight happens. That's where your heart starts beating fast. You get sweaty palms, dry mouth, and it tells your body to move or stay. So you're going to freeze, fight or flight, that response. So if that starts to get disruptive for people with traumatic stress, and this is what we know from our fMRI studies that happens, the signal doesn't go back to the cortex. So what you have are people misperceiving that there is a threat when in fact there's really not. And there's no cortical functioning to tell them this is not threatening for you. So when you come and ask someone, hey, I didn't see you in group on Tuesday. Hey, what are you talking about? Get off my back. You're like, hey, I'm just, hey, no. They perceive a threat where there is none. So in terms of psychosocial functioning, that's the neurological underpinning of it. So what do? The good news is, for all you clinical psychologists, that we can actually reverse some of this damage without touching a scalpel. And we do it through therapy, psychotherapy. Because remember, these are emotional memories and perceptions. That's where a clinical psychologist lives. This is where we make our bread and butter. And if you can help someone to alter and to understand their perception, how they're misperceiving things, integrate it into their memory, create new neural connections, new neural memories that aren't charged to the amygdala in this fear response, then you start to see people who are able to function interpersonally without getting activated. Isn't that amazing? We have scans that prove that that's true. And I thought that was true. Now we actually have the proof. Well, what do we think about in terms of overall functioning? So that's just from a neurological point of view. But when we look at behaviorally and interpersonally, trauma has profound impact, particularly when we look at people who've suffered from childhood trauma. And this sense of alienation is really key, because you'll get people who have a lot of friends, a lot of associates, but they'll tell you they're lonely. They'll tell you they don't feel a part of. They'll tell you they're just acting. And that's that sense of alienation. And some of that's derealization, depersonalization that can come with the dissociative aspect of trauma and PTSD as well. Mistrust, that guardedness that I was just talking about. We ask, where were you in group? And people get really upset. People who grew up in a family where you didn't talk about what was happening get really good at keeping secrets. So they don't even tell you what's going on with them, even though there's no cost to them sharing that with you. It's just not what they do. And then you all come up to them and want to get all up in their business, asking them who they had sex with, where's a protector. They're like, oh, I just came here for some medication and you want to get off my business. Because they're used to having secretive behaviors. So if you think about it from an intervention, from a prevention standpoint, there's probably some work we have to do to demystify sharing information and assuring people that it's safe to do so. And safety is key. And you'll hear me talk a lot about safety and security, because this is what the brain is trying to do that's been traumatized, is reach this homeostasis. This sense of emptiness and detachment can lead people to have indiscriminate sex, use drugs and other things to try and fill that emptiness. And this is a really anhedonia, this loss of pleasure of living. This is a high risk for suicide. So when you have someone who's telling you that there's just no joy, that things that used to make them laugh just aren't funny anymore, this is a really high risk for suicide. And in all of my interventions, we have an intervention for creating joy. And we call it, dreaming your best dream. And what does that look like? And really teaching people how to have the F word, fun. And they'll say, I don't know what's fun. What should I do? What do people do? And we think having a hobby and enjoying things that make us laugh, that just seems normal to us. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not normal for a lot of people, and they don't even know how to begin to engage in that. They had no models growing up for that. None. Was there a question? And this is really hard to teach. It's like, well, what makes you laugh? And they're like, nothing. Okay. Well, do you like anything? Not really. Oh, okay. So what do you do in that case when you have someone and you're like, and they're like, and I don't particularly like people. But I want to be around people, but I don't like people because I don't trust people. So I have to tell people, is it that you don't like people because people are just like horrible creatures? Or is it that you don't trust people to take care of your best interests, to take care of you? And if you can get them to start thinking more broadly, they usually will say, you know, I guess I don't trust them, but I don't like them either. So part of it is, well, do you like me? Not sure yet. Not sure. Okay, I'll take not sure. You know, you say things that sound good to me, but I don't know if it was going to work for me. So I'll take that. Because I know that for many people, particularly who've had childhood trauma, they've got an attachment disruption. If the very person who's supposed to love you and nurture you is harming you or neglecting you or putting you in circumstances that are hurtful to you, you start to lose the ability to have a healthy attachment. So what do I mean by healthy attachment? It means when I reach out to Dr. Rimian, I have faith he's going to reach back, and reach back in the same caring, compassionate way. I might avoid him, you know, if I have an avoidant attachment because I don't trust he's going to reach back. I might have an insecure attachment where even though he reaches back, I still don't trust that he's going to reach back. And so I keep going and asking more and more. And he has to keep reassuring me. That's an insecure attachment. Or I might have an ambivalent type of attachment where sometimes I'm willing to reach out and sometimes I'm not. But all of those things in terms of attachment become important when we work with people with HIV, because relationships, sexual relationships, always mimic our attachment styles, always. You know, who we choose as a partner mimics our attachment style. And if we're trying to fix a relationship that we had with a parent who was non-validating, guess what? I'm going to choose a non-validating partner so I can fix that. How does that work? You know, can we ever fix another adult? I've learned no. You know, we're not fixing nobody. People have to want to change themselves. And so you can see how from a traumatic beginning standpoint, you can get all of these difficulties as it relates to interpersonal relationships. And the instability and the how charged these relationships are. You know, from a violent standpoint, from just an intensity, I can't live without this person. We know that that's a neuroscience and amygdala, thalamus, hippocampal area of the limbic system of the brain that's being activated in response to previous trauma. And so, you know, well, what do we do about all of this? You know, so we know that this is happening. From an intervention standpoint, the most important thing we can do, and this says, I'm right there in the room and no one even acknowledges me. And that's what trauma's like. You know, when we have a third of people living with HIV that have experienced, more than a third, who've experienced a traumatic experience, and we don't ask them about their trauma, well, we become like the big elephant in the room. And so people always ask me, well, how do I do it? You know, if I ask people about some bad things, it could make things worse, right? All the data tells us no. In fact, it's just the opposite. I asked a woman, had she ever been sexually abused in childhood? She's 70 years old. And she looks at me and she says, you know, this isn't my first rodeo. And I'm like, oh, okay. Tell me more. And she's like, you know, you're like about my 10th therapist I've ever had in my life. I'm like, oh, okay. You know, my hands are sweating, like, whoa, okay. Whew. You know, all right. And she says, You're the only person who ever asked me that. It's like, oh, okay. And I'm still not knowing, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And she starts crying. She says, yes. And then she tells me about her life and what she's done and what's happened. And that as she's talking about this, I can see how the other therapy got close, but no one asked about the elephant in the room. 70 years old. So, here we developed in response to some of the providers and the physicians saying, well, what can I do? How can I do a quick screen? And so we adapted this from Kimberly et al. Rachel Kimberly works at the National VA Center in Palo Alto, and they created a much larger screen for PTSD. But we wanted something short that you could ask 7 questions, and that people in primary care settings didn't find offensive. And so I'm just putting that there for you all. If you get a copy of these slides, that you can have it. Because people always ask, well, how do you ask about these things? And why is it important to ask? Why do we care that there's the elephant in the room? Well, we care because the comorbidity of co-occurring disorders with trauma are just, this is just a handful, because I didn't have enough slides to tell you. There's probably no disorders that aren't impacted adversely by trauma. And it's because it has that neurological component that influences behavior. So anytime you want someone to be compliant or adherent or follow up or follow through with anything that you're trying to do for them, and there's a history of trauma getting in the way, then you're going to have to address the trauma in order for them to find a better way of following through that's not impacted by how they feel about it. So what does it mean for what you all do? I think it means that no matter, and I always tell people when I teach students in clinical psychology how about psychotherapy, and we do behavioral medicine, I tell them good therapy is trauma-informed therapy. If everyone did trauma-informed therapy, that would just be good therapy. We call it trauma-informed because we know now what we should be doing based on our experience working with trauma populations, but it's just good therapy. So what does it mean? It means that whatever interventions, whatever preventions that you're trying to create, you want to keep in mind that people are interested in safety and protection, both at the macro and the micro level. So how you approach people has to be in a safe environment. People need to feel that their best interests are being considered and protected. If you're just walking up to people on the fly in a busy room where other people can overhear you, people might not perceive that as being safe. So it's at every interaction, it's how we set up our rooms for our interventions and our assessments. All of those things we need to have an ear and an eye towards. If someone is traumatized, how are they going to feel in this space? To what's on the walls. My patients come in my office and they look at my walls and they'll say, is that new? They notice all changes. They are primed to see if something in the environment has changed, because where they come from, if something changed, that might not be a good thing. So you have to be on guard about these things. And remember, when you're really looking at trying to protect people, what we're trying to do is reduce their fear response. We're trying to reduce that feeling of vulnerability or anxiety, uncertainty. The safer people feel, the less anxiety and fear come up. It's just the two cannot coexist. You can't feel safe and anxious at the same time. So you want your environment to be validating. People need to know that you believe them. One of the biggest fears people have is if I tell you what happened to me, you won't believe me. Or even worse, you may say it was my fault. I should have done something. For people who have a physiological reaction, particularly to sexual abuse, and sometimes physical abuse too, and what I mean by a physical reaction, if some people have an orgasm, or if children seek affection from the person who's abusing them, they start to self-blame and think something is wrong with me. How could I have reacted this way to something so horrible? And so we have to normalize that and validate that and explain to them just from a biological standpoint what's happening so that they can understand what their response to that was and why that was. And give them back a sense of control. Because at the heart of this, when your body and your mind betray you, as many of these individuals describe it, they feel a sense of out of control. So if I'm feeling out of control, I'm going to do things to feel in control, whether that means taking drugs, having unprotected sex, all of those kind of things. The cognitive challenges, if I'm misperceiving things, if my mind is in such a way that I have difficulty remembering things and learning, that speaks to what we need to do in terms of how we deliver our messages, how frequently we deliver them, using different modalities to deliver them. You know, I always say overlearning. We have to help people to overlearn so that they can interpret it and incorporate it into their lifestyle and their changes. Affect regulation is a big, big, big part of what we do because of the fear response. So teaching people diaphragmatic breathing, meditation. People can't go there first until they trust you and feel safe, though. You know, if you tell people, close your eyes, start breathing deeply, that can be something that really sets them off if they don't feel safe and in a place where they can do that comfortably. So you have to explain to them, you know, this is where all of our cognitive behavioral therapy stuff works. You got to give people the information, you got to teach them the skills, help them problem solve any barriers and facilitate the facilitators to that behavior change, and then set up some goals around it. You know, all of that works, but you got to be able to do it within a trauma-informed environment where people feel safe and protected in doing it. And that comes with compassion. You know, I don't change who I am. I tell people, it's okay, you don't have to trust me. I got to earn that. And how do I earn it? I come to you in the same way all the time. My clinic runs the same way. My research projects, if we say it starts at 10, we're starting at 10. You can't call us and try to get us to move off that either, because people are going to test you. Can I really trust you? How about if you give me your cell phone number and I call you? Nope, you can't have my cell phone number. You know, we've got to have healthy boundaries here. And that means saying no, and saying no compassionately. And even if people get distressed in that, that's okay. Because remember, this is an attachment disorder. It's just like when you tell a 2-year-old no, and they really want that extra ice cream, and they throw a tantrum. Good parents stick with the no and let that tantrum kind of wind down, and then you do some comforting, but you don't get the ice cream. Well, good therapies are the same way. We have to have our boundaries. They're there to keep people safe. You explain that to people, and then they can start to respect it. I've had people say, you know, I tried you. I kept trying to come to group late. You actually kicked me out. I remember I cursed you out. I said, yeah, I remember that too. Yep. And they'll say, I'm glad you didn't accept me back. I wasn't ready yet. But I'm ready now, because when I got kicked out of group, I then had to go and get myself sober, and now I'm ready for your group. And I appreciate that you didn't let me do what I wanted to do, because so many people in the past had, because they were afraid of my anger. And I was thinking, well, I was afraid of it too. but I can play poker. So what does all this mean for us? Well, listen, this is hard work. And I'm not going to say it's not. You know, I can laugh about some of these things now, but when someone's threatening and yelling at you, that's a scary place to be. And people that are living with HIV, their lives are complex, and often their psychological needs go unmet, and they'll tell you this. And so when they find a place of well-meaning, compassionate people, it can be a little unnerving for them, and the trust isn't so easily earned, and we have to be patient with that. And we have to allow people to have their journey on their health and their recovery, but it doesn't mean that we retract our boundaries, retract what we're doing. Just some people might not be ready for what you're putting forth, and that's okay. I want to tell you that's okay, because people have to find their way to recovery. And so we need to tailor this to culturally appropriate settings. You know, what we were doing in Malawi looks nothing like what we were doing in the Bay Area, because we had to really integrate the culture. And that is the language, that's the social support, how that social support's delivered, all of those things we had to consider when we were doing that. And we learned that from the population. I didn't know that. You know, the women in Malawi told me what was going to work for them. I didn't tell them. And we have to bolster the psychosocial functioning, you know, particularly as it relates to trauma. We have to inform people about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I have an anatomical book in my office. When I treat people with trauma, I take it to a photo similar to what I showed you, and I said, this is what's happening in your brain. And it's just profound when they say, oh my God, it's not my fault. And I can get better. You're telling me there are things I can do that'll make this better? Yep. It starts by coming and doing the work what you're doing here. And that emotional processing right there starts to change their brain forever. And if you think about it from our own lived experience, do we not feel powerful when we feel in control? When we can say, yes, I want this. No, I don't want that. And it happens in our lives. When we achieve a goal we set out for ourselves. And if it was hard, that's even better. It's like, wow, I went through that. The people we're working with are no different. And so we really have to allow them to understand that if their brains are functioning in a healthy way, they are able to achieve the things that they set out for themselves when they were this high to do. And that message to them is so empowering, and it's empowering to me, and it helps me in my life as I work with trauma patients. People often ask me, how do you work with all these people that are so traumatized? And we hear all this laughter going on in your office. And I say, I'm the healthiest I can be when I'm working with trauma patients, because it forces me to live what I'm speaking to you. I can't talk to you about self-care, exercise, good diet, good nutrition, and tell you how that influences your reactivity to stress if I'm not doing it. And so it becomes a really symbiotic relationship where the healthier I get, the healthier the people that I'm working with get. So I hope that that encourages you all to do your own self-care as you're pursuing really difficult studies, and, you know, research grants are hard to write, and it takes so much time, and you're not able to spend time with your families because you're working with difficult populations. But I want you to take time for yourself, because the healthier you get, we always say, we have a saying in our clinic, anxiety is contagious, trauma is contagious. And so, and I say health is contagious too. The healthier I am, the more grounded I am, the more balanced I am when I step into a really stressful situation, then the response I get back is more measured. And so that's what I've got for you, and I'm looking for questions and comments, and I saw some head nodding, so I know some of you are working with some of these people that hit you, and just looking for any feedback around that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
That was great. I'm glad we have time for discussion.
Yeah.
My therapist.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.